This evening, we're going to talk about the SCOTUS affirmative action, the decision, something we'll probably come to understand over the next decade, not weeks or months or even today. So the purpose of these is to help us understand the interface, in our case, of medicine and society, medicine, social consciousness issues that we deal with within medicine and beyond medicine. And this topic is certainly one that goes beyond medicine. It started out as something attending to the issues of two undergraduate schools, perhaps certain ethnic and minority groups and underserved represented groups in our society, but blossomed out in a way that we're still trying to understand. And it will have a profound effect on both what we do in higher education, in medical school, and perhaps even in our recruitment strategies. And the response has been actually quite broad and confusing around the country, and hopefully we'll get some sense of that. So I'm not going to go too much into the details of the topic. Many of us have read various news accounts, and maybe some are even scholars. We certainly have one with us who I'm sure has read every page of the decision. I'll remind you that next month, February 14th, I think that's Valentine's Day, we're going to explore the benefits and perils of artificial intelligence in medicine. And that'll be a different type of a topic. And then on April 10th, we'll explore how healthy is the culture of academic medicine and the various issues and biases and complexities that we all bring to what we do. I'd also like to thank Cynthia and Mark Lucio, Cynthia Blue and Mark Lucio, for putting together tonight's session and getting the group and all of you to come join us today. So our speakers this evening, I'll just briefly introduce them. Brian Adamson, who you see his presentation here, will start, and as you see, is the Associate Dean for Diversity and Inclusion and the David L. and Ann Brennan Professor of Law. He'll give us an overview of both of the decision and how to place a new legal framework. And then our guests this evening as faculty speakers are Lena Mehta, Associate Dean for Medical School Education. She just finished a 5-year term as the National Chair for the AAMC Committee on Admissions, so has been deeply involved with these conversations within the medical school community. Richard Sigg, who is the Director of Recruitment for the Jack Joseph Mandel School of Social Sciences, so thank you for joining us, and has a perspective from their admissions process. And then I think it's important to understand and hear from our medical students and our MSTP students. So Tenine alum and Selen Rajul have been through the process recently, know the pulse of the planet of their fellow students. And Alicia from MSTP also has a perspective on the process that she went through and now what she sees as her friends, colleagues, and younger associates. And then on Zoom, we have a distinguished Deputy Director of the NIH Brain Initiative, Andrea Beckel-Michner, who will describe how the NIH has responded. And we know from the NIH across agencies that there is a broad expectation for all of us writing grants, especially large grants, to include in our discussion a plan to enhance diversity, that's what it's called, for cancer centers, and in the BRAIN program, plan to enhance diverse perspective. I like to call it inclusive scholarship, but we all have our way of thinking about this. And then finally, of course, Monday is Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and we will be celebrating this on Wednesday, January 17th, with Ed Barksdale from University Hospital, who is the Chief Surgeon of Pediatric Surgery, who will talk on advancing health justice. My head was science and my heart was social justice. He's been very, very involved in these topics, and I would ask you not to miss that. Without further ado, time to listen to Brian.
Good evening, everyone. Dr. Gerson, thank you very much, Dean, for inviting me here. Dr. Kubel, Oh, there she is. Thank you, Doctor, for putting together this panel. This is wonderful, and I'm appreciative of being here with Richard, Tassim, Alicia, and Andrea. And I hope to be able to spend 15 or 20 minutes to sort of set the context for the conversation today. I've been asked to spend no more than 15, 20 minutes at the most, and I'm gonna hold to that because I'm excited about getting to the most important part of it. That is the dialogue where all the learning can occur. So on June 29th, 2023, the Supreme Court issued its decision in the 6-3 decision on students for fair admissions versus Harvard and the University of North Carolina. And there, the Supreme Court held that the use of race in admissions decisions as a factor in college admissions decisions violated both the 14th Amendment of the Constitution as well as the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And so we're going to be here spending a few minutes to discuss that decision. What I wanted to do is sort of lay out some of the basic facts of the decision, the issues that were at play in the decision, the court ruling and the reasoning behind its ruling. Give you just a brief snapshot of the concurrences and the dissents that were issued and published in this opinion, and then talk about the impacts of the decision, immediate and what we're seeing today, and how schools like ours have responded to the decision. So at issue were both Harvard University's, a private institution, and University of North Carolina's process for admitting undergraduate students. Important distinction is that Harvard's private university and University of North Carolina is a public university, which impel the examination of the use of race in admissions from both the equal protection constitutional perspective as well as the statutory Title VI Civil Rights Act perspective. The latter which apply to public institutions, right? So there in Harvard, for example, there was a 3-step process that they engaged in making the decisions as to making admits. They had 6 categories, and they would rate an applicant on one of 6 factors, those being academic, extracurricular, athletic, school support, personal, and overall. A 1 across the board signified for an applicant that they had more than a 90% chance of being admitted, right? So that was the scale in which Harvard was using. And that 1 over an overall rating signified the chances were pretty high. All right, from there was an admissions subcommittee that met to evaluate the applicants, in particular geographic regions. And then the full admissions committee met to make sure that, 1, the numbers that they were seeing with regards to race sort of at least track to some degree the numbers that they had seen the year before by geographic region, right? And then once they were assured of that, so there we know that race was being taken into consideration, right? So once the full committee did that, race was also taken into account, obviously there, right? And the final step, there was what they call a LOP, an LOP, a list of potential admittees. And then you had that final category, your final group of potential admittees. And then they were looked at, not only because on account of race, but legacy status, athletic status, financial aid eligibility, and the like. And then the full committee determined who would be admitted, right? There it was found by the trial court, after a full trial in the federal district court, that race at that 3rd step was a determinative tip for some of the applicants who were ultimately admitted, right? And that's what the facts that were underlying, those were underlying facts with regards to Harvard. With regards to University of North Carolina, their admissions process was a little bit more fluid, right? And so race and ethnicity was considered in the readers, the application, the admissions department readers review. Race was an explicit factor, one of many, right? Along with academic performance, rigorous standardized testing, extracurricular involvement. They had personal statements, personal character standards, as well as the student background. And once again, according to a record at the trial court, in that case, in the case of University of North Carolina, the readers provided numerical ratings for the academic, extracurricular, personal, and essay categories. And during the years that were at issue in the litigation, the years that they were looking at, right, they found that minority students were more likely to score highly on their personal ratings than their white or Asian Asian American peers, but were more likely to be rated lower by University of North Carolina readers when it came to extracurricular activities, academic performance, etc. But in University of North Carolina, the readers of the applications were allowed to add a plus to as based on the race of the applicant, right? And in that case, the court found that race could play a significant factor in an individual's case as to whether or not they would be admitted or not. Ultimately, after there was a preliminary procedural issue as to whether or not the plaintiffs, the students for fair admissions, had standing, that is to say, did they even have a right to be in court? There's this doctrine of standing that applies, procedural constitutional doctrine that applies in cases where the person has to demonstrate, a person before the court, in this case the plaintiffs, have to demonstrate some type of injury in fact that can be addressed by the court. They got through that procedural hurdle, the organization did, and so the court made that determination. Yes, they had standing, now we can get to the merits of the case, and ultimately this is what they held, that the use of race as a factor in college admissions decisions violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, as well as the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, right? So a little bit about the Equal Protection Clause, just checking my time here. A little bit about the Equal Protection Clause here, right? The 14th Amendment provides this, right? That the states shall not deny equal protection of the laws, and there you have it, right? It basically says that people, individuals in similar background with similar situations should be treated equally by the law, right? A primary motivation for the Equal Protection Clause, right, was to validate the equality provisions that were found in the 1866 Civil Rights Statutes, right, Civil Rights Act of 1866, which guaranteed that all citizens would have guaranteed rights to equal protection of the law. Now, as a whole, the 14th Amendment marked, a huge, a seismic shift in American constitutionalism, right? Basically, applying substantially more constitutional restrictions as to what states could and could not do with regards to equal protection than had been applied even before the Civil War, right? And so you have articulated out of the initial ratification of the 14th Amendment some seminal cases interpreting the 14th Amendment, right? We have Strata versus West Virginia, Yickwo versus Hopkins, and most infamously, Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically upheld this doctrine of separate versus equal. That case briefly had to do with the segregation of blacks and whites on train cars. And the question became whether or not that separation was separate or equal. Blacks were relegated to another more inferior train car. The court there held famously that separate is equal. That is the right to segregation. 14th Amendment allowed segregation on the basis of race. Under the vigorous and controversial dissent of Justice Harlan, who uttered, and I'll get to that in a second, one of the most famous articulations in the history of jurisprudence. And then fast forward, right, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954 and 1955, which basically eliminated discrimination by law and segregation by law. Started with the schools, right? The public school systems, and then that falls, the dominoes fall in terms of housing, in terms of busing, in terms of pools, in terms of all types of public spaces, in terms of, in the sense of what is separate cannot inherently cannot be equal in the United States. So undoing and unraveling that. Fast forward more, and the Supreme Court here in SFFA spends a good deal of time talking about these cases that address 14th Amendment equal protection, specifically in the context of higher education. And so these cases generally just sort of mark where the court went with regards to whether or not the use of race in admissions violated the 14th Amendment or not. Initially, you had, for example, the Regents, the Bakke case, where you had the University of California Medical School, which set aside 16 slots out of 100 slots for minority applicants, right? And the question became whether or not that type of quota system was unconstitutional. The court held that it was, but the court said that diversity, a diverse student body is permissible constitutionally as a goal in higher education. And it could even act as a plus factor in a file. However, there couldn't be any quotas. It was a 16 out of 100 that was constitutionally objectionable in Bakke. Right? Then you move to Grutter, which dealt with the University of Michigan, not only undergraduate, but graduate admissions at the University of Michigan. And there, in part at least, in some ways, important ways, the Supreme Court upheld Bakke, or at least didn't depart far from Bakke, when they found that, educational institutions are saying diversity is an important goal to have in the schools and in institutions. We're gonna defer to that. We're gonna defer to your judgment that what you're doing in terms of creating a diverse student body is constitutionally permissible. We're going to defer to your educational expertise and judgment. However, no quotas. You can't insulate the minorities from competition with majority applicants. And Justice O'Connor's majority opinion here famously said, okay, we may have to revisit this in 25 years, right? And almost to the year, right? We're 25 years later, not quite 20 years later. We revisited it here, but in the meantime, we had Fisher versus University of Texas. Let me just go back quickly and say that Regents, the Bakke case, infamously also, there was no decision that commanded a majority opinion. That hardly ever happens. And so it was a fractured decision. It was a controversial decision. And so what the precedent that came out of it was the one that carried the most votes, 4 votes, right? Fisher, the University of Texas, in response to an earlier case, Hopwood, that struck down a particular affirmative action system, decided to do a top 10 admissions policy. The top 10 students from every public high school institution in the state of Texas would be admitted to a University of Texas institution, college, university, right? Abigail Fisher, top 10%, and then for the remaining, those remaining admission slots, they would give to other applicants, but they could also take race into consideration there. Abigail Fisher was not admitted, and she felt that taking race into consideration discriminated against her on the basis of her race. She was a white woman. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the University of Texas, Austin. She wanted to get into Austin. Use of race as a factor in admissions process. And that ruling allowed Texas and other universities across the nation to continue using race as a part of their admissions decisions until where we are now. So, as I mentioned, the court found that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And what happens in when a court is finding that something is using race, or if a policy or law or a procedure is using race as a factor, it engages in what you call strict scrutiny. Is a procedural approach to looking at certain types of issues or policies like we have here in University of North Carolina, as well as Harvard, where because they're using race explicitly, the court is going to engage in strict scrutiny. And there's a test there that if the strict scrutiny means that in this case, Harvard and University of North Carolina have to have a compelling interest in using race, and they have a compelling interest and compelling goal, and then their means for achieving that goal has to be narrowly tailored. Right? Strict scrutiny is just one of three types of scrutiny that a court will engage in. There's a rational basis test. There's an intermediate scrutiny test that's used when there are gender distinctions. But then you have race, which is the highest and most difficult to overcome. It's often said that if something is analyzed in a strict scrutiny, it is fatal. A policy or law rarely survives strict scrutiny, as we can see here. And the court held that these reasons that they pointed out, both Harvard and North Carolina, were compelling, but they didn't justify the means by which they attempted to achieve their goals. What they said, for example, they failed to articulate a meaningful connection between the race of the applicants and the goals that they hope to achieve, those ones that I just articulated there, right? They also found that the goals, that the way in which the universities measured the racial composition, for example, because of race, they categorized applicants according to Asian, Hispanic, Pacific Islander, white, African American, and Native American, were fugitive, right? They were amorphous, and they were applied over-inclusively and under-inclusively, right? They were imprecise as overbroad or underbroad, and felt that they were just improper and not improperly tailored to meet their goals of creating that diverse student body that they wanted to create, that they were hoping to create, right? Then ultimately, as I said, they were the Chief Justice who penned the majority opinion. Chief Justice Roberts said that, under no circumstances can race or should race be used as a negative, right? The other judges wrote opinions. Most, I think, significantly, it was Sotomayor's, who read hers from the bench. Her dissent from the bench was really vehemently against the ultimate decision, basically feeling that the court cemented superficial rule of colorblindness as a constitutional principle in society where race still mattered. So that was her particular position. She said that an interpretation of the 14th Amendment is not only contrary to precedent in the entire teachings of our history, but is also grounded in the illusions that racial inequality is a problem of a different generation. She also made a point of noting, out of all in this decision, which ostensibly applied to all undergraduate admissions programs and institutions, the majority intentionally said exempted military universities and colleges, right? And explicitly said that in a footnote, and she takes issue with that. Justice Roberts distinguished military academics as potentially excluded from the court's decision, and Justice Sotomayor says, in the end, when the court speaks of a colorblind constitution, it cannot really mean it, for it is faced with a body of law that recognizes that race-conscious measures are permissible under the Equal Protection Clause. Instead, what the court actually lands on is an understanding that of the Constitution that is colorblind sometimes when the court chooses. And then, so to close, Um, what we're tussling with here, and the dean and I, and we were just discussing this, some of the this thing that animates judicial opinions in part is judicial philosophy, and how judicial philosophy impacts and influences how text is read and interpreted, and how laws are applied, much like unlike medicine, right? And so you had this really palpable, visible battle between ideologies in this case. The idea of originalism, and then what a living, breathing document, like some people would say, like Sotomayor and Justice Jackson would say, should apply and should be ever evolving. But importantly, you have this inconsistency ostensibly between what the originalists are saying. If the philosophy of originalism is to look at the text of the Constitution and interpret its plain meaning and look at its history, then one could validly conclude that it explicitly allows, or its intention was to allow race to be taken into consideration in certain cases, right? And that's the position of the dissenters. And Justice Thomas spends his concurrence fighting back on that premise. Once again, interpreting the historical record of the 14th Amendment in a way that's very different than what the minority proposed, right? So what's left? What's permitted to be used, right? You can take diversity into consideration still, right? It's just that in an admissions application, an institution can't ask the race of a particular applicant. The applicant to talk about race, applicant talk about race as a benefit, something that was overcome, something, discrimination as inspiration, discrimination as hurdle, or otherwise, right? The applicant can put that in the foreground, right? And certainly institutions take other mechanisms and means to try to attain a diverse student body. That has not gone away. That's the sum of things.
This has been alluded to already. I'm Cynthia Caboon, who's the Vice Dean for Faculty, and Mark, Alicia, and I are co-conspirators in this initiative in terms of really the goal is to have lively dialogue about controversial topics that impact academic medicine writ large. At this point, I want to have our panelists come up, and I'm going to have them have a seat here with Dr. Adamson. And the panelists, they do know that they're on a strict 5-minute schedule, but I've got my timer going here, my stopwatch. So we are going to hold with our virtual panelist will present last. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just introduce people, and I would have you just introduce yourself a little bit, your role, the perspective you're going to take. And I think, quite frankly, we're going to just go in the order that you're lined up here. I just mixed it up on y'all, but that's okay. You can handle flexibility. And then we'll end with Dr. Andrea Beckel-Mitchner, okay? So why don't we go ahead? Lena, why don't you get going, please?
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Lena Maida. I'm Associate Dean for Admissions for Medical Students at our School of Medicine. I'm also a practicing nuclear radiologist. As Dean Gerson mentioned, I recently just finished a 5-year term as the chair of the National Committee on Admissions for the Association of American Medical Colleges. It's been a tumultuous 5 years, to say the least, with COVID and navigating that, and now with the SCOTUS decision, which we've been preparing for a good 18 months at the national admissions level and the regional admissions constituency as well. Even though we've been preparing, when the decision came out, we felt very unprepared because the moral of the story is I think this is going to be a very iterative process. It's not clear cut. It remains to be seen how we can continue to maintain our commitment to our patient populations, how we can continue to ensure improvement in our somewhat dismal healthcare outcomes for our patients of color. So despite our fervored preparations, we are still taken aback. So I want to preface my comments by saying this is going to be a work in progress.
This is probably generational work that we're now facing in terms of not just advancing equity, maintaining equity, and then advancing it feels almost like an aspirational goal at this point. So starting things off on a very depressing note, I will try to add some solutions as we go through. So certainly for somebody like myself who sits in this juxtaposed position of admitting students into a program and also practicing in my field, I sort of want to comment on it's a double jeopardy situation. We always had trouble getting as much diversity in our classes as we could to represent our population at large. We know that the data shows very well that healthcare outcomes are improved when we have diverse practitioners in the field, not only because patients respond better to practitioners who come from similar backgrounds, who have similar lived experiences, who look like them, but also for practitioners who have been able to learn and have horizons expanded by training alongside colleagues who come with diverse viewpoints. I always used to say to my students, if we're doing our jobs right, you're going to learn as much or more from each other than you do from us. And so diversity in every definition, age, race, ethnic background, geographic, life experiences, undergraduate major, graduate work, you name it, diversity in every sphere is something that our admissions committee values and has always taken deeply into consideration. So the rules have changed a little bit. We're allowed to take some of those parameters into consideration. We're not allowed to take other parameters into consideration. We have always struggled. Every admissions program, regardless of your discipline, has, as I said, struggled with getting a representative student body who mirrors the patient population, who mirrors the client population, whatever demographic, whatever field you want to touch on. We all had similar struggles. That said, we've come up with strategies through the years to try and enhance the diversity of our cohorts, and that is under the name holistic review, holistic admissions. For those of you who are not familiar with it, it's looking at all aspects of an application outside of just academic metrics. It's looking at lived experiences, backgrounds, perspectives, experiences, exposures, commitments to potentially practicing in certain fields. And so we know that holistic admissions, which is something we've all been doing, is something that becomes even more important as we move forward. So some of the ramifications, of course, that we will see are a drop in our students who come from diverse backgrounds. Of the 9 states who have had elimination of affirmative action over the past 20 to 30 years, we know that they've seen a precipitous drop off in their diverse students, ranging as high as 40%. And so some of these states have not been able to recover in the way that we would like. They're still seeing significant reductions in diversity of their student bodies. So we need to be very pragmatic and understand that this is likely what's going to happen until we can start to figure out how to move forward in this new era. So there's that. There's now the conversation, the Department of Justice and the Department of Education in August, and I'm not a lawyer, so if I say something wrong from a legal perspective, please give me some grace on that. But the DOE and the DOJ in August issued a statement talking about what we can and can't do on the basis of the SCOTUS ruling regarding affirmative action. The thing they did not touch on was scholarship at that time. Financial aid and scholarship went unspoken. But now the current thinking is that awarding merit aid or scholarships based on race and ethnicity will not pass strict scrutiny. We just heard what that was. So now we know that we can't use any type of financial enhancements to help with our recruitment efforts as well. So we have that as well that we need to contend with. The other thing that we're well aware of is that our pipeline is probably going to further diminish as undergraduate institutions are faced with the same complications that we are in terms of admitting diverse student bodies. So it's really sort of going to be a multi-layered issue that we need to find ways to overcome. So what can we do? I think I'm only allowed to offer one solution, and I'll get to that in a moment. But it is a very multi-layered, complex situation that we're facing. Every admissions committee, every admissions office across the country is having very robust conversations right now about what we can do to enhance this. From a really operational perspective, virtually every admissions department has removed race and ethnicity from their application. As we heard, applicants are allowed to and encouraged to talk about their lived experiences. For this incoming cohort of applicants, we know that we weren't sure what to tell our applicants. We weren't sure what the extent of the SCOTUS ruling was going to be. We knew that there were applicants who were frightened to even mention this. What would happen to their applications? Were there going to be legal ramifications? So now we know that we will encourage our applicants to speak authentically and genuinely about what their lived experiences have been. We can use all this information to look for attributes. We can look for characteristics and qualities. We can't use the lived experience based only on the experience that they had, but we need to be able to ascribe all of these attributes, values to it. One of the things we're trying to be very, very careful of is as we reset our attributes, values that we're looking for in our students, that the opposite is not achieved, that we are further potentially discriminating against students who we want to admit into our classes. So that's a very delicate tightrope which doesn't have answers, and we know that's going to iterate over time. So holistic review is the sort of the solution I can offer in this immediate short-term period. As I said, this is going to be generational work to see, alas, how we can get to where we want to go and exceed that benchmark. So we've all used holistic review. Every medical school has used holistic review. Probably every other admissions office in every other discipline has used it. But now we expand what it means. We, as you may be aware, U.S. News and World Report was sort of the governing light for so many medical schools. Happily, over the past few years, the emphasis on U.S. News rankings has diminished. And we are now able to, and we are committed to, and with deep conversation with Dean Gerson, we are expanding our metrics, we're expanding our pool. We have done deep dives into who's successful in medical school. We know that it is not directly tied to GPA or MCAT. We know those are indicators, but we know they're not ends all or be all. So we're expanding the criteria of the students we're examining, who we're interviewing, who we're admitting to medical school. We can take socioeconomic factors into consideration. We can take educational first gen. We can take languages spoken. We can take so many different things into consideration. So these are all areas that we're looking at in a yet more expansive way than we have done before. So lots of challenge exist, but we will hopefully get there. Thank you.
Fantastic. Can you just hand it down to Jasine and Celine, and Jasine, and just introduce yourselves again, please?
Hi everyone, my name is Selen Rajul. I'm a second year medical student here at Case Western. I'm also a co-leader of the Health Advocacy Organization, which is a student-led organization that helps run voter drives, but also speaks with legislators about different health-related topics, as well as submitting testimony. And my colleague Tessita and I submitted an op-ed about SB 83, which is an anti-DEI bill that's currently being under debate in Ohio. So medical students are understandably really worried about the SCOTUS decision on affirmative action, but I would like to stress that this decision did not occur in a vacuum. Like I mentioned, there's an uptick in anti-DEI legislation across the nation, so including Ohio with SB 83, but also Florida, Texas, North Carolina, as well as an increase in anti-immigrant and anti-minority rhetoric, both on the national stage, but also within our communities. So this has a lot of ripple effects into the healthcare system, both within our medical institutions, but also our education institutions. So even prior to the SCOTUS decision on affirmative action, the percent of African Americans in Case Western's class of 2023 was only 12%, and this decreased in the class of 2026, which is my class, to 6%, with the national average being 11.3%. We believe that the SCOTUS decision, like Dr. Maida mentioned, will only exacerbate the already present disparity within our medical spaces. And this concerns medical students for two reasons, one of which is how we receive medical education. So like Dr. Maida mentioned, we will have fewer opportunities to learn from each other's variety of lived experiences, which limits our ability to truly hone in and develop cultural humility for cultures other than the ones that we are familiar with. This in turn leads to our second concern, which is how it will impact patient care. We know through countless numbers of studies and interactions with our patients that communities of color and disenfranchised communities receive their care best and are most comfortable with providers that look like them and can speak their language. And with a less diverse medical class, you'll have it'll translate into fewer minorities being able to assume positions of power and able to serve the communities that they are from. And as a result, patients won't feel as comfortable with their providers as they do not have enough education as they should have had. And it will translate into greater medical stigma, greater medical mistrust, and overall poorer health outcomes. And my colleague Tenine will talk about some of the solutions we cooked up.
Hi there. So my name is Tenine. I'm also a second-year medical student. To give an overview of my resume, for those of you who are Marvel fans, I'm going to use a quote uttered by Falcon, Captain America, and either the Winter Soldier or Civil War. I do what she does, only slower. So, thank you. So with that said, based on this dreary landscape, how do we move forward? So Dr. Maida outlined some of the important angles, which is with regards to our holistic review process in admissions. Fortunately, the ruling did leave us a degree of wiggle room, and now we've had a year afterwards to see where that wiggle room can operate in admissions. However, it's important that we're not just careful in the process of how do we select students, but in what we do internally at this medical school, as well as what we do with the community around us and in the broader medical community externally. So on the internal lens, it's imperative that we make sure that not only are we admitting a diverse cohort of students, but that these students are treated with equity, with respect, that we're adhering to the DEI principles that we talk about. There need to be systems in place of not only ensuring that all individuals at all levels, be it faculty members, students, medical professionals who we interact with, are appropriately trained and implement these principles. Unfortunately, there also need to be means of reporting how do these principles need to be improved. It's a really tough situation when, as Selen pointed out, underrepresented minorities in medicine, for instance, at our school, make up 6% of the population. So if there's a problem that's faced by them, it can be seen as, oh, only a small minority of students are complaining about them. So we need to make sure that there's ways to not only implement these DEI protocols, but also make sure that students' voices are heard, make sure that students are promoted, that student organizations representing such populations, not only underrepresented populations in medicine, but also underrepresented populations with regards to race, sexuality, creed, and more, receive proper funding and support, both with regards to initiatives that they have, as well as fostering dialogue. Externally, we need to make sure that we're interacting with our community. Per a study by UC Berkeley, Cleveland ranks as the 6th most segregated city in the entire United States. And so this population is one that really needs a hand. And so how do you do that? Often by using pipeline programs and implementing them to better assist the community, ensure that individuals down the lines can receive access to our strong medical education. The ruling that we're talking about today, it addresses race, and as we know, there are many structural factors that make race matter. However, it's not stopping us from addressing those structural factors by making sure we implement DEI, by making sure we incorporate pipeline programs, and by, as Dr. Maida has also stated, making sure that we stand as an example for how schools can implement such protocols in admission, in their culture, in faculty hiring, now going forward and standing up for other institutions in the state of Ohio in the face of legislation like SB 83 that will aim to undercut diversity and other issues. Thank you all so much for listening, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Hi, everybody. My name is Alicia Stanton. I am a CASE prep alumnus, and I'm now in my 5th year of the MD PhD program here at CASE. So I'm in my 3rd year of the PhD portion. I'm currently serving as the president of the Biomedical Graduate Student Organization. I'm also a founding member of the Trainee Empowerment and Alliance Committee, as well as a founding member of the new minority graduate student group that we're creating. That is the Alliance for Advancing Diverse Initiatives of Graduate Students. And I'm also a founding member of the Mental Health and Wellness Committee within the MSTP Council. So throughout all of these roles, I've had quite an experience and a variety of experiences here at Case Western that are directly or indirectly related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm going to share a little bit about the graduate student perspective as a whole and kind of focus on the PhD side, since we kind of already have the MD perspective shared with us. And also the email I received so that we could propose solution (S). So I'm going to propose more than one. So I actually believe the most compelling question that we should now be asking ourselves is, how do we attract and retain a diverse group of people? Now that we can't take race into account in terms of, making sure that we have a certain percentile of interviewees and a certain percentile of accepted applicants that fit different race categories into our school, we have to figure out, how do we attract those applicants to make sure that those numbers of applicants stay high? And then ultimately, how do we retain them once they're here? So my solutions and suggestions are going to pertain to both students, but as well as the faculty. For graduate students, having a diverse set of faculty is very important to us. We need mentors that understand our backgrounds, that have shared experiences, and that can help us succeed from those shared experiences moving forward. So for the PhD side of things, I would say having a diverse faculty group is also important. So my suggestions on how to develop this inclusive environment for diversity are areas where I think Case Western specifically could use a little bit more improvement. So most importantly, the school policies and expectations around diversity, equity, inclusion must be communicated clearly, early, and all members of the institution should be receiving regular training on cultural sensitivity and as well as bystander intervention. I also think that we should work to create an inclusive environment by examining our current policies for promotion or awards to see if there may be any unwritten rules where biases could ultimately exist. And then to avoid burnout, especially for diverse faculty and students, I think we should start to scrutinize the potential tokenism, or the minority tax as it's called sometimes, when forming any committees or assigning any positions. And then I also think that service equity could be increased by recognizing invisible service, such as doing tasks outside of official responsibilities. And this can include things such as providing emotional support or mentoring for students or fellow colleagues that I think sometimes goes underappreciated, but definitely takes a lot of time from our faculty mentors. And then finally, I think we could also be celebrating diverse contributions and outstanding performance more frequently. Ultimately, in terms of the SCOTUS decision, I do believe that if we focus on how do we retain this diverse group of people, we will innately attract more diverse candidates to our institution. But we should also actively and purposefully be recruiting diverse students to this school. A few things that I think we could be doing a little bit better in this aspect is attending recruitment events at diversity-focused STEM conferences, such as SACNAS, Abercams, SWE. Right now, or in the past, I don't think Case Western has really gone to these events or had quite the presence, and I think it's going to become even more impactful and more important moving forward that we show our face and have a good presence at these diverse-focused conferences for undergraduate students. And then I think we could also help reach out to diverse undergraduate students in terms of them applying to Case Western graduate programs if we focus on creating a network with the directors of different diversity-focused research scholarship programs. So these are things such as URISE, the McNair Scholars, LSAMP, all of these different types of programs that are nationally funded or regionally funded. Having a network with those directors can definitely allow Case Western to be on the radar for those diverse student populations. And so together, I believe that these suggestions will help transform Case Western into an institution that a diverse group of students and faculty will not only choose to attend, but will ultimately help them thrive.
Fantastic. some of those initiatives have been in place, and the dean can speak to it, but certainly Marvin Neiman's been really active in terms of going to a number of those events. But I think those were fantastic. Richard, please.
Thank you. My name is Richard Sig. I'm Director for Admissions and Recruitment at the Mandel School here at Case Western Reserve University, where we support the Masters of Social Work program as well as Masters in Nonprofit Organizations. Had the unique opportunity to work in recruiting social work students for now about 16 years. At my previous institution, in addition to social work, I also started the public health program there from an admissions and recruitment perspective. So I have a unique kind of sense and understanding of both health disparities as well as how this interrelates with social sciences and medicine as well. To be honest, I made some notes, but I'm not sure I really need to say anything because, they really touched on a lot of the areas that I was also going to mention and reference. So I will share some of these. I'll try to keep them short, but hopefully I won't, or I'll compliment what everyone said, but not necessarily repeat everything. I think there's so many different ways that we can look at the challenges that this decision has raised. And so it's almost impossible to just narrow it down to one or two. When I think about it just kind of in context, I think that there are two big overarching areas. One is truly the risk of overreach with what this decision means. It can impact the way in which schools respond. They may become very concerned about litigation and really take a lot of steps back to really negatively impact the work that they're doing or had been doing to recruit students. The second thing is from a prospective student standpoint, it was mentioned earlier, students can fear this and think, what? Quite possibly, maybe I wouldn't have gotten in if I'm applying to the school, when that's not necessarily the case, or that was not the case. And so it can create a lot of fear for students to actually move forward with an application to different programs, no matter what type of graduate degree that they're applying to. I think the more serious implication, which was also touched on, is truly the long-term implications. When you combine this decision with really the past few years or many years of kind of a lot of civil and social justice unrest within the country, and really kind of amplified by public narrative when it comes to a lot of the state house decisions in different states, trying to target diversity and inclusion related initiatives. That puts a lot of fear in schools, that puts a lot of fear in people and students. And that can really have long-term implications. As it was referenced, as it relates to kind of the historical distrust among people of color and healthcare institutions, it's not different with social work and the way clinical practice has been over the years. There is a lot of distrust with clinicians because many times clinicians don't look like the populations that they're serving. And when that happens, it leads to long-term generational challenges that are hard to overcome. And so just to kind of highlight a couple kind of moving towards, I would say, solutions and thinking about this, just to kind of jump ahead. I want to point out when it comes to some of the data as it relates to, in particular, faculty. I think from our perspective in our School of Social Work, one of the things we always emphasize is if our faculty don't look like our students, then our students are not going to want to come to us. And so we really need to focus on the diversity of our faculty within the school to ensure that we're helping to recruit a diverse student body. Nationally, based on the American Association of Medical Colleges, within faculty, only 3.8% of all faculty are Black or identify as Black, and 3.5% identify as Hispanic or Latino. When you look at from a promotion level, when you move into professor level rankings, that drops to 2.21% Black professors and 2.7%. I mean, when you really think about that in medical schools, it's really, really dismal. And so there needs to be a greater emphasis on building that pipeline, which kind of leads me to my overall solution. When it comes to solutions, I would say it really does need to focus on building those pipelines. From an admission standpoint, it could be developing true partnerships with not only institutions that serve historically underrepresented students, but also looking to further that beyond a college or university, but looking at looking at high schools, because once again, if in a high school or a middle school, people do not see themselves in this profession, then they're not going to move into this profession. Prior to working in graduate admissions, I worked in undergrad admissions. And in the cities and the areas that I worked, I could see how different counselors treated their students. When you were in, let's just say, the center of Columbus schools versus in Dublin, which is an area just right outside of Columbus. Like the counselors themselves, even the bias and really the discrimination that they showed to their own students was always very surprising to me as I worked in undergrad admissions. And so this is something that universities really need to step forward and really address with those at that level, and to build programs to help establish greater interest, greater awareness, and realization that they can be successful in this area. So I'll just kind of stop there and move on if that's okay.
Fantastic. And what we're going to do is transition now to Andrea. Maybe needs to help me with that. There you are. Great.
Here I am. I turned my camera off because my head is so large. I didn't want to look like the Wizard of Oz with everybody. But I really appreciate the opportunity to be there. Thank you for allowing me to join virtually. I really share and reflect so many of what's been said by the panel members, and appreciate the experience and the struggle. So let me introduce myself. I'm Andrea Beckel-Michener. I'm at NIH, specifically the National Institute of Mental Health, although my day job is Deputy Director of something called the Brain Initiative. The Brain Initiative is made up of 10 of the institutes at NIH, all of those that support brain science, including NIMH, mental health, where I am. And we're an initiative, I'll just briefly describe it because it is relevant, an initiative that is really trying to be very forward-thinking in terms of the kinds of science that we're supporting and the way science is done. Specifically neuroscience and technology development for studying the brain and understanding the brain. So we've been in existence for 10 years, and every year we do a demographic analysis. And frankly, we weren't doing very well in many categories in terms of the research that we are supporting through the NIH grants, the Brain Initiative grants. We looked across demographic categories. We also broadened our analysis to include the types of institutions where brain funding goes. We're looking at all different kinds of categories for the PIs, the principal investigators on our grants, including career stage, as well as their representation in science. And again, we weren't doing very well. So in the spirit of looking for solutions, one of the things we did, which again was a pilot for NIH overall, was to develop a program that we call the Plan for Enhancing Diverse Perspectives. What is that? That includes, so for all brain initiative applications that were coming in for funding, looking for funding support, the investigator had to include a one-page summary of how their project, how they were promoting equity and inclusion in their own project. This was quite novel, is quite novel, in that it was also part of the scored application. So reviewers could consider the Plan for Enhancing Diverse Perspectives, I'm just going to call it PEDP now, could include the PEDP alongside the science. And what was critical was that the plan, the elements of the plan, had to integrate with the project goals and the aims of the science. We gave examples of this. We provide examples such as recruitment of personnel, again, career stage, a geographical location of the institutions seeking funding, outreach to other organizations and institutions, institution type. Are you a research one, an R1 institution, or a resource limited institution, minority serving institution, undergraduate focused institution, et cetera. And finally, also for those that used human subjects, looking for ways to diversify their human subjects that were participating in research projects. Again, this was a pilot program that was developed pre-SCOTUS decision of last year. So just like all of you and other institutions and universities across the country, we've had to re-examine the language that was used, and we are making changes to comply with the legal framework that is in front of us. I am not a lawyer, but we consult with our Office of General Counsel, and we have been developing sort of the PEDP 2.0, we're calling it. But right now, PEDP 1.0 is still active. And I think the critical features, and we're doing an analysis, that's another key part of this, is that we want to evaluate the impact of having a PEDP in the first place. Does it enhance the science? Does it reduce discrimination in some ways? Does it provide professional development opportunities? Are we gaining in areas of the country that we have not provided support to before? As you might imagine, when we do our analysis, we have a very bi-coastal distribution of our funds, with 3 states, California, Massachusetts, and New York, being well represented, overrepresented in my opinion. And so part of what this plan might do is to recruit and engage institutions from additional geographical locations. So we are in the process of that evaluation for our fiscal year 23 plans. We don't have the answer to that yet, but I sort of want to believe we're onto something. One thing that we can't do is make funding decisions based on race, ethnicity, gender, age, et cetera, protected classes of the PI and the project team. But that's not new. We have never been able to do that. The authorization that we get from Congress does not allow us to make those decisions. So that part hasn't changed. But what is a little more complicated and nuanced is how we, again, from the decision and just in general, how we allow personal background and lived experience to be a part of a plan for enhancing diverse perspectives. We think that's allowable, but we have to find ways to allow that to be part of a PEDP, have applicants understand what that means, have reviewers, as you know, NIH reviews tens of thousands of applications every year. How do we make sure that everybody is essentially on the same page and what those expectations are, the various do's and don'ts, and then finally how those funding decisions are made. Again, I think this is not a simple revision of what we have out there now, but we just had a meeting with leadership at NIH, and they are still enthusiastic about continuing to do something like this within the bounds of what our OGC is telling us is allowable, which is encouraging. I think NIH does want to do the right thing. We recognize the shortcomings of the biomedical funding processes led primarily by NIH in this country, but other organizations as well. And so NIH leadership really is very interested in understanding how we can continue to do this kind of activity or these sorts of activities, reward institutions and investigators that are doing the right thing, encourage investigators and institutions to do the right thing that maybe have not thought about it before. And frankly, if part of the application, if a poor PEDP comes in with an application, that science will not be supported because their plan for enhancing inclusivity is not up to par.
Thank you.
I could go on, but I know we have limited time. I'm happy to answer questions during the discussion, but I can also happy to hand this back over for more panel discussion as well.
Thank you so much, Andrea. I just want to say, sitting as a reviewer, I've seen how these are actually shaping and driving their score changing. And people are being responsive to this. So I think this is outstanding. And I'd like to point out that Cleveland is not in California, New York, or Massachusetts. And some of us are submitting grants to the BRAIN Initiative. So with that, I'm going to open up. No, and I don't think I violated anything in terms of anything. I'm going to open this up and I want people to engage with the panelists. We do have food and drink outside afterwards to continue the discussion, but I'm curious as to what people think about these thoughts. These are not easy issues, as somebody, in fact, who's sitting in the audience here, is sometimes, there are two principles that are conflicting. One is kind of the idea that this rugged individualism and we all do it based on merit versus kind of a desire for diversity. And there was a beautiful essay in the Times on Sunday about pointing out the fact that these are not mutually exclusive concepts. But sometimes we're stuck and we have to prioritize one over the other because it's not a level playing field. And meritocracy is based on the idea of a level playing field, and it isn't. So how do we figure out solutions forward given what our current constraints are? And I'm going to be quiet now and see what.
I'll just make one comment related to that. I think the whole point is what we think of merit or what people define as merit needs to change.
Yes.
That's what it comes down to.
And those were some points that were brought up in terms of promotion criteria. Clara.
I probably can talk loud enough.
Okay.
I was kind of horrified to hear that the percentage of underrepresented minorities has gone down by half. Just in the most recent classes of medical school, this has happened before the SCOTUS decision. This was happening. So what do you think was happening there?
I can comment on that because those are my students. Over here.
So we did drop in African American students, but went up with Latino and Latinx students. So not equal in any way, but it was 1 year, but financial aid, merit-based scholarships. We are not a school with a large endowment. We're not able to compete with some of our peer schools. It'll be interesting to see how things may shake out when we're no longer supposed to be awarding merit and other scholarship money based on race and ethnicity. So this is the only denominator we're able to find.
Color just went down.
No,
The number of applicants of color stayed the same. Our ability to retain went down.
Thank you. I just want to second what you just said, but maybe make it a little bit more, I don't want to be overly contrarian, but the fact is that we are here because of the court's decision, and this is what frames everything. But what we hear is that until last summer, or whenever the court handed it, all the DI effort we've had for, I don't know, Dr. Mehta, maybe 8-10 years or so, have been, if we are at 6 or 10% at the city of Cleveland, have been a total failure, right? So I think framing it in the context of the court, does not seem to me to be the issue. It means that we have failed in doing it prior to that. And I think that's partly what you wanted to say. And in a case, in an absurd way, maybe it was a good thing because it makes us sit in the room and discuss it. Right? It means to me, from the outsider, if the data are at 6 or 10%, that whatever we have done for DEI over the past decade or whenever we started doing that is completely non-effectual. Unless we can say it takes long, but I don't know if that's the only answer. Thank you.
I think that's a difficult leap to make from an N of 1 year against a backdrop of 18 years with different numbers. So I think, yes, that we definitely sat up and took notice when numbers dropped last year, but I think that's an extreme statement to make on an N of 1. So yes, it was a disappointing year, but we're analyzing it and retrospectively
looking at it. Again, the number of Latino, Latinx students went up. Maybe there was a difference in the focus and the way in which we approached our students, but I'd be careful making such an extreme assumption on that 1 year. So, but that said, yes, we are not at an advantage compared to other medical schools of our same category who have much larger endowments. As I said, it may be interesting to see what happens when we're no longer able to consider race and ethnicity and how we award merit scholarships. That said, our need-based aid isn't potentially as good as some of our peer schools either, so that's a separate conversation that we need to work on. So yes, we are ratcheting up whatever DE&I efforts we can do right now. Again, with the caveat that we didn't know what we were going to be allowed to do. and our recruitment already had occurred by the time the SCOTUS decision was rendered. So this may be a year where we're going to have to learn a lot of lessons. I don't know. So we're just going to have to wait and see and improve our efforts in any way that we can.
Yeah.
Also to weigh in from a student perspective, and then we'll obviously be happy to move to other questions. Obviously concur that taking statistics out of context, it can be a difficult thing to say, but nonetheless, I think you do point out an important issue that populations are severely underrepresented in medicine. I would also like to point, however, that as structural race is multifaceted, likewise, their abilities to, in this, what ends up being represented in the body of medical school also ends up being multifaceted and provides us all a lot of room for reflection on where to improve. For instance, one statistic that I found particularly compelling, and I don't think I quite realized it until I got to medical school, last I checked, and please correct if I'm wrong, approximately 40% of current medical students have a physician parent. A lot of getting into medical school, higher education, like graduate school, and then likewise down the line, getting appointed in positions in academic medicine, it requires almost a subtle understanding of how to play the game beyond your GPA and MCAT. And unfortunately, that adds yet another layer to these structural issues. So while it's not, I would hesitate to simply say it's a failure of DEI on the part of the school, but I think that it's important to reflect on the entire bandwidth of academic medicine as a whole and recognize that race plays more of a part than just what you fill out on your census. It means that, unfortunately, you more likely grew up in a district that had different funding for schools based on segregation that is still intact since the Jim Crow era, and likewise came from backgrounds that are differently represented in these different fields, lack the networking opportunities, the abilities to get ahead on research, or even the ability to, for instance, perform unpaid research over a summer in college. So you have to work a job, whereas other people are able to take a very low wage and do research. So while I hear you and I don't want to invalidate the concern, I think what's important and productive for a next step is acknowledging the lived experiences, as you've talked about, as we've all talked about, in holistic review of applicants entering med school, as well as promotion through each and every next step. Really take a look at all of these factors, frankly, because we have to now, not only in the wake of this decision, but also if we really want to fix the problem that you outlined. That's how we're going to have to do it to truly evaluate these applicants.
Not to mention implicit bias.
Hello, everyone. So I have two questions. One is just a clarification point to your point. I think in terms of, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think the delivery kind of made people kind of startled a little bit, but I kind of interpreted it as you're saying that, yes, it's an N of one because of the decision. However, as Dr. Mehta was pointing out, there is a track record. So if we were to go back and look at the data and look at the trends for the last 18 years before this decision, I know there's ups and downs, but it's not necessarily an N of one in that case. So what does the trend represent? At least that's how I took it. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then my second question, I think one of the panelists, Richard, excuse me if you're a doctor, but was that this has kind of been brought up in a sense of, there are pipelines that need to be strengthened, right? And so as we're saying, Cleveland is majority African-American city. So what currently, or what kind of things have been done or in place to kind of strengthen that pipeline? Because we've mentioned undergrad, we've mentioned graduate students, we mentioned faculty, right? But in terms of synthesizing those all together, I'd be interested in hearing the panelists' thoughts in terms of what are some ways that can be done and how can that be done in Case Western?
Some of those panels are, some of these pipelines are in place, and we've been pulling a lot of those together. But I think the synthesizing is an important point, because we do have them, and Lena knows of some of these as well as others in terms of these pipelines. But the challenge is making those payoffs, because everybody's competing for these top students. And I don't know, I see you nodding your head. I don't know if you want to
I was just going to say I agree with that. It was a seismic thing that the university did when they decided to allow Cleveland public school graduates admission, all other things being equal, tuition free. That was a huge step, right? Pipelines that the doctor and Richard talked about, the law school experience. We approached pre-law advisors at HBCUs, at Hispanic serving institutions, at Native American, Alaska Native serving institutions, at Asian American serving institutions, and offered them incentives to enter into 5-year strategic partnerships, where if their students graduated from their school and came in or presented certain credentials, all other things being equal, we could offer them incentives in terms of tuition scholarships, free books, guaranteed employment in the summer, a stipend if they chose to work in low bono or no bono professions in law. And then in the third year of law school, their final year of law school, we could give them a stipend that would go toward their studies for their bar exam. And we have those pipeline strategic partnerships in place with Tuskegee, Morehouse, Spelman, Hampton, Xavier, Tougaloo, John Jay College of Criminal Justice, University of North Carolina, Pembroke, University of Alaska, Anchorage, the Bemidji State University, which is a first-gen college, or predominantly first-gen students. And we're looking to expand those and expand our numbers of ways to admit those students. That doesn't violate anything of SFFA, because those schools, although they're minority serving institutions, they don't have a litmus test in terms of race or who's admitted to those schools. So that's how we're trying to move the needle in this way.
Richard, maybe I'm going to pick on you for a second. You talk about, we touched on this in our own conversation about retention that was alluded to kind of obliquely. Can you just elaborate a little bit on your ideas regarding retention while I ask the people in the back to help me see the chat, because I saw something come up and it's not on my screen.
Be happy to. So going along with whether it be pipeline programs, I know this was also touched on from a student perspective. If students do not feel included here, then it's really hard to retain them. I know that even within our own context within the School of Social Work, there have been times when students have really raised a lot of concerns about the way in which they're included within our community. And so ensuring that not just faculty, but staff are really kind of brought up to speed with understanding how to support and create an inclusive environment, I think is really, really critical. I mean, I don't necessarily have any or all of the answers, but I just think that's just an important piece that if the school doesn't own it, not just at a school level, but a university level as well, when that student comes from Tuskegee, they're going to have a bad experience if they don't feel welcomed and included here. And so there's a lot of steps that also need to go in place to ensure that the pipeline programs or any type of DEI initiative is really kind of successful, so that students are retained and graduate, because otherwise it's not going to benefit anybody. So I think it's really important that those steps are in place. I also think we need to remember that there's a lot of imposter syndrome that can happen among students. It can happen among staff and faculty. And so recognizing that is another kind of key aspect of some of that training and what support systems need to be in place to help students to be, or others to be, successful.
Yeah, I'll just chime in as a minority student who is supposed to be a part of the pipeline and is in the pipeline, I guess. Some things that I think Case Western could be doing better with the pipeline is I do feel like we have decent outreach towards high school students. We have a good high school research programs that come into the university over the summer, and that's great. But from my experience on the graduate education side, there is like a drop off of undergraduate students that at least make it to the School of Medicine research side. So really increasing those research initiatives for undergraduate students. I went to a public institution, Oklahoma State University, and I feel like they had more programs for undergraduate, like minority-focused research scholarship programs, including LSAMP and URISE, and the McNair Scholars. And I'm personally not aware if Case Western has any of those. And if we do, we should be advertising that more, and definitely bolstering those different groups. I know that we just recently started a SACNIS program here within the undergraduates that is also trying to get graduate students involved, but that only started a year ago. So we could even be doing more efforts there in terms of these nationally recognized diverse research related organizations. And then not to call out the MD side of things, but as someone who went to Abercrombie and who went to SACNIS and has now gone as a student representative this past year, the MD side was less represented at those conferences for recruiting applicants. And it is in the middle of your interviewing season, so it's very difficult. But so many students, almost 50% of those that came to our booth were interested in the MD, and we didn't have an MD admissions representative there to speak to them. So I do think that it's important to reach out to them in that aspect and show that we care about diversity students by going to these conferences and making the effort. Because of all of these different nationally recognized research programs that help undergraduates get into graduate school, I think Case Western specifically needs to be looking at that retainment during graduate students phase. How many of our minority students aren't making it to graduation? How many of them are mastering out? We really need to be scrutinizing that and looking at that. I don't know the statistics on that, but I can think of a few minority students, friends of mine, that decided to master out because they did not feel like they were included here at Case Western, or didn't feel like they had the support that they needed here at Case Western. So I think that that is another gap in our pipeline here at Case that we could be examining a little bit further. And then also advertisement of opportunities for diverse students. There are fellowships that are specifically for diverse applicants, such as the F31 diversity. You can also apply for minority supplements on your PIs, RO1s and R grants, and that's not advertised enough, and students don't get support in writing those supplements all the time. And so I think just exposing minority students to the different opportunities that they have and providing them more support helps keep them in the pipeline, especially into academia, because having those fellowships and those minority supplements look really good on your CV and help you get into academic positions if that's ultimately what we're thinking of as the pipeline here at Case. So those are just my thoughts as a graduate student.
That's outstanding. I think this highlights too, one of the other goals is making connections, because we're all so busy and all committed to this work, but we benefit from hearing other people's perspectives. Like I see Lena already thinking and planning ahead, who's going to be going to these conferences to represent Med Ed. And I think that this is really an opportunity to use this as a growth mindset and how do we make things better for our broader community. I am,
Cynthia?
Yeah.
Bill was in the queue, and then this person was, and then the chat one popped in.
Okay, I saw that chat one. We couldn't see that. So maybe these last two, and I'll see if we can get the chat again, because we looked here and we could not see it.
Okay.
But then we can maybe continue the conversation outside.
Yes, definitely. Go ahead.
So I would very much agree. I think the pipeline issue has been one of the big struggles we've had. I will say from 1990 to about the year 2000, when Richard Hansen was the chair of biochemistry, we actually had a faculty exchange program with Meharry in Nashville, and we actually had several faculty that would go down and teach there, and Ifani Arenzi, who was the chair of biochemistry there, would come up and teach here. And I think having that kind of physical exchange actually sets up a situation where you have a better opportunity to potentially recruit from some of the minority schools, rather than just having a recruiter go through and say, here's what we've got and we'd welcome you. So it's more of a personal and time commitment touch that I think works.
should I go? I'll go now. Or
Yeah, go.
oh, okay. So my question has to do with what sort of as a discussion we had earlier on when we're discussing the limitations of that endowment size poses to the ability for our school to more competitively recruit students who are underrepresented at our school. So aside from all the different strategies like looking at zip code or reading more essays, has there been any discussion with the provost or the trustees regarding the price of tuition, regarding considering that the cost of attendance here is the second highest in any medical school in the country, and that even after financial aid, we're still in the top 10 of most expensive medical schools?
There have been conversations, or one of the few schools that is relatively flat. We used to have a probably 3 to 4% increase every year. After conversation with the provost and the board, we're now at about a 1% increase annually. So slow, very slow, but it is a positive sign that there are attempts to try and slow that increase down.
I want to have everybody thank all of our panelists, including Andrea from the NIH, and please continue discussion outside.